What's the only weekly wrap-up of the top compliance and ethics stories? It is This Week in FCPA with Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, and Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor. Each week, Tom and Jay highlight 10 stories which caught their collective eye, talk about sports and movies, highlight top podcasts, and preview their upcoming events. Join This Week in FCPA each week for a one-stop review of the week's compliance and ethics highlights. This Week in FCPA is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
This week's stories include Africa's richest woman is accused of looting Angola. I wrap up my multi-part series on the Astros sign-stealing scandal. Mike Volkov takes a look at the year in OFAC enforcement. How can you use the Benchkowski memo internally? Matt Kelly takes a look at the latest Edelman Trust report. If you ever wondered how the Department of Justice drafts policies, Clara Hudson reports on a Matthew Minor speech. 5 men are indicted in a massive cryptocurrency scheme, and a comparison of the French and United Kingdom guidance on cooperation in anti-corruption enforcement actions. We conclude with asking the question, did the SFO miss an opportunity with its internal guidance? These stories and more on This Week in FCPA. This Week in FCPA is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, back again with Mr. Monitor's Jay Rosen for This Week in FCPA, episode 189 for the week ending January 24, 2020. The Off With Their Heads edition. Jay, will another kleptocrat lose their ill-gotten gains? What are going to be the final fallout for Major League Baseball? And what are you up to?
Well, those are all three good questions that I think we'll answer. Let's deal with with these in terms of magnitude first. So why don't you tell us what is happening with Africa's richest woman, Isabel dos Santos?
So Isabel dos Santos is the daughter of the former premier of Angola, and he had I think, 24-year run as the premier. And he and his family completely looted the country. That's how she got to be the richest woman in Africa. And she has been, accused of massive looting. She claims it was all through hard work that she amassed this wealth. But in a stunning New York Times article, that I believe came out last Sunday, it talked about the number of shell corporations and the strategies and tactics used that she was able to get money out of Angola and into her bank accounts. The story focused also on the U.S. companies that were involved in facilitating that, and it was the usual suspects, PwC, Boston Consulting, McKinsey, all of the companies we've seen in other African countries as well. This led to just a flurry of commentary. First of all, the CEO of PwC said that heads may roll over the firm's work for Dos Santos, the lead partner in charge of PwC's work for her, left the firm this week. There are calls for investigations, of course, as was with the Gupta family scandal in South Africa. FCPA implications are plethoraed all over the place, in addition to money laundering issues. So when people wonder, aren't we at the end of the multi-billion-dollar scandals? Here we are, the first 20 days of January, and we're already into the first scandal, multi-billion-dollar scandal of 2020. It just never seems to stop, Jay.
Well, and to continue on with our chronicling of imbroglios, January has also kept Tom Fox very busy as he's written about his hometown Astros and giving us some fodder that will probably come to roost when we talk about the Red Sox. But this week, Tom had 3 more parts in his blog post looking at the Houston Astros scandal. On the 19th, Tom looked at the ethics and the truth of the game and spoke about the self-proclaimed special one, Jose Moreno, and talking about the fact that you really can't change the truth of the game. And Tom looked at the hard numbers, how the Astros differed at home and away. And then he asked the question about, why do we have ethics in sports? Is it to teach youngsters the importance of fair play as a social construct? Is it to create a level playing field for those who compete and do so on hard work? Or is it simply to do the right thing? With regard to the special one, the Astros have grossly failed. In his second blog post of the week, Tom looked at the whistleblower and amnesty, and an interesting thing that I wanted to tie into. He brought up a conversation with ESPN's Jessica Mendoza, who was a former softball player. And this is a very interesting thing that she was speaking for ESPN. She was speaking about whistleblowers, and somehow she's also a consultant to the New York Mets. And she seemed to stress what many players seem to be thinking, that they had a bigger problem with the whistleblowers going public than if they would have done this privately. So it's a really, Tom really gets into the weeds here, talking about how it was negative in terms of how the whistleblower was being perceived, but also quite a positive that Major League Baseball was able to get through this investigation in less than 2 months. And Tom hypothesizes that maybe these multi-year FCPA investigations really don't need to take as long as they do. And in his final blog post, he takes a look at culture and why does it matter, and that although the Astros were going to be wearing the C for cheaters, the scarlet letter on their uniform, one thing that we may not have considered is how the baseball players are going to police this by themselves. So if you're a fan of the game, you know if somebody throws in a little bit tight on your batter, or tries to brush them back or bean their brains out, that you can be sure that the next time that person is up, there is going to be retribution. So it'll be interesting to see how we go into the season and whether any retribution is shown against current Astros players or former players from the team on 2017. So hopefully Tom can set his sights on something else, but there is still a plethora of Astro stories out there.
So, Jay, next, Mike Volkov continued his exploration of enforcement actions in 2019, but this time he focused on OFAC, and he had a great two-part series. Part one focused on the enforcement actions and the significant trends, and part two looked at the OFAC compliance guidance that came out. In the trends, he found four basic themes that I think every ABC compliance practitioner needs to be aware about, Jay. It included supply chain risk, distribution business risk, third-party liability risk, and then the fourth one was the risk around the changing nature of sanctioned countries and how that has changed so rapidly under the Trump administration. Of course, the OFAC guidance was huge news in not only the OFAC community, but the ABC community as well. And he reviews that in terms of the five major elements: senior management, commitment, risk assessment, internal controls, testing and auditing, and training, and then fleshes those out a little bit. So great couple of articles by Mike. And the thing I would just like to emphasize, Jay, is these articles are not for the OFAC compliance practitioner. These need to be read by the anti-bribery, anti-corruption compliance practitioner, because we need our people, our community needs to understand OFAC is increasing its enforcement. It's going to overlap with the Department of Justice enforcement, and you're going to need to show compliance with the OFAC compliance framework, and it makes good business sense as well. So it seems, Jay, you have figured out a way to use the Binkowski memo internally within a corporation. What were you able to data mine with that?
Yeah, so this comes out of my weekly blog on corporate compliance insights. And in this week, I look at the ramifications of the Benzikowski memo and recent DOJ policy changes and consider how companies can use the information from the memo to bolster the internal compliance programs. As we've seen now, the DOJ now mandates that companies coming before them have an effective compliance program. The days of wheeling in a large stack of documents are long gone and forgotten, but now companies must have substantive evidence of not just their program, but also its effectiveness. One of the strongest elements I take away from the Benzikowski memo is that a company needs to demonstrate that it has an effective compliance program, and from there you move to remediation and strengthening the program, which the memo addresses. If you begin with the premise that your company has a program, then the next step is to assess the program's strength and effectiveness as well as its weaknesses. So what does the company do if it uncovers a problem? Does it have the wherewithal to conduct a thorough investigation and determine whether or not something has to be self-reported to the government? On the remediation side, has the company gone deep enough to find out the root cause of the problem? Questions such as, how do we get here and what do we do to address it can become paramount. And one of the key elements the memo underscores is how seriously the company takes its compliance program obligation and what it does when the problem has been discovered. The memo employs companies to both recognize that they have a strong investigative process and also to move to strengthen it. Another internal area the company can focus on is discipline for those who engage in internal controls and policies and policy violations. But even more critical going forward is maintaining a fair process for discipline and incentives around compliance. This means that discipline is meted out fairly. Internal controls testing also play a big role in the company, and a company could pose multiple internal inquiries based upon what are controls around cash. Do you have some kind of mechanism for determining where cash is being spent? Do you have control over bank accounts? And do you have control over who is making these decisions? Next week, in part 3 of this blog post, I'm going to explore now, since we've taken care of how do we leverage this internally, how can we use this information communicated in these memos to affect our external policies?
Jay, next up, we've got an article from Matt Kelly over at Radical Compliance. Of course, Matt's the coolest guy in compliance. Yeah, the coolest guy in compliance. He reviews the Edelman Trust Report, the 2020 Edelman Trust Barometer, which was released this week, and he finds some fairly disconcerting news. The Edelman Trust Barometer has been published now for 20 years, and it looks like distrust is growing in large, prosperous countries, really in a way that we have not seen in quite some time. People, while they trust their individual employer, and see businesses as competent, they do not see businesses as ethical. Trust gap is emerging between well-educated people and everyone else. Distrust is growing in large, prosperous countries, as I mentioned. And then consumers expect brands to take stands on social issues and then act. So lots of information in here. He's got a section on trust and implications for compliance professionals. So take a look at it. Read the Edelman Report. It's always informational, and unfortunately, it's enlightening in a kind of a depressing way this time around.
So have you ever wondered how the DOJ drafts its new policies?
I have. That's a question that is on my mind. How do they do it?
Well, thankfully, we have some answers. We have some answers from Clara Hudson reporting in Global Investigations Review, and she had a conversation with former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Matt Miner, who is now back in private practice, and he's rejoined Morgan Lewis. He oversaw the Criminal Division's fraud and appellate sections, working closely with the Criminal Division Chief Brian Benzikowski. Miner was involved in drafting a number of policy tweaks and updates, including the guidance for inability to pay claims and a revision of the department's guidance on imposing corporate monitors. Following his DOJ departure, Miner spoke to GIR about how he and the variety of teams worked together to pen the changes. Miner's role at DOJ required him to work on multiple matters at once, which meant that he divided his time between the department's various priorities. For example, a critical issue Minor devoted much of his efforts to was combating prescription opioid issues. He elaborated that it was important to make sure the criminal division's language gelled with policies across other DOJ components. Minor pointed to the National Security Division's December self-reporting policy, which has many similarities to the DOJ's FCPA corporate enforcement policy. The monitorship memo was one of the more straightforward ones to rework, Minor said, as it was mainly an update to the so-called Brewer memo, named after the man who penned it, former Criminal Defense Division Chief Lanny Brewer. Through the process of revamping the monitorship memo, Minor said he and Bensikowski were already thinking about the updates to the DOJ's compliance guidance, which took more time and effort, and the latest compliance guidance that was unveiled last April. The guidance is intended to help prosecutors determine how to assess a company's compliance program and decide what changes to bring to reach settlements. When in private practice, before he took on the criminal division, Minor argued that compliance should be given more weight in charging decisions. And explaining why these decision updates were so important, Minor echoed what DOJ officials have stated repeatedly over the past several years as they roll out tweaks. Clarity is a friend of the government because it helps prosecutors, lawyers, and companies know what to expect. So when we're often talking about the roadmap that is being laid out by DOJ, we can thank Minor for his efforts when he was in the government in harmonizing these different programs. Tom, next up, 5 men were indicted in a massive cryptocurrency scheme. Our good friend in Philadelphia, Jonathan Marks, took a look on it in his Board in Fraud blog. What says Jonathan?
So, Jay, this was a fascinating story, which we probably need to file under. You couldn't make a movie about this, or you couldn't write a novel about this, rather, because fiction has to be grounded in reality. On December 10th, 2019, 3 men were arrested in connection with an alleged $722 million cryptocurrency mining fraud scheme. There is an additional defendant at large. The scheme was incredibly sophisticated, and Jonathan details that in his blog post. It exploits, obviously, the cryptocurrency world, particularly in terms of the peer-to-peer network. So when you have that network kind of outside the banking system and outside the regulatory system, you see how scammers can have a really more straightforward approach. And Jonathan details that. He details how this fits into the fraud Pentagon and the anti-fraud measures you need to put in place, both in terms of prevention, detection, and perception. And also, I think an important thing that we all need to remember, Jay, which is the dangers of irresponsible investing. And so the perpetrators of the scheme were competent enough to promote and sell their ideas and dupe literally investors out of hundreds of millions of dollars because of the lack of understanding of Bitcoin, blockchain, and cryptocurrency, these basic terms in the new economy. So great piece from Jonathan. And I would sort of put this under the category of what is risk and are you managing your own risk?
So as we do usually on a weekly basis, we've got a story here from New York University's Compliance and Enforcement blog, and we've got a slew of lawyers from SCAD and ARPS who compare and contrast UK and French guidance on cooperation. On June 27th of this past year, the French financial prosecutor and the French anti-corruption agency published joint guidelines regarding the legal framework governing French DPAs. The SFO also did a similar thing on August 6th of this past year as part of the SFO operational handbook, detailing the steps companies are expected to undertake to obtain cooperation credit. Both sets of guidelines demonstrate further alignment of these jurisdictions' deferred prosecution agreement regimes with longstanding practices in the U.S., albeit with some notable areas of divergence. I'll touch upon 3 of those. First, in terms of looking at self-disclosure, investigations, and cooperation credit, The French, in their guidance, discuss how a company can meet the condition for obtaining their form of a DPA, including standards for adequate cooperation. Much as the U.S. guidance encourages voluntary self-disclosure and cooperation with authorities, the French acknowledged for the first time the importance of internal investigations as a potential prerequisite to securing a DPA. The UK co-cooperation guidance, while shifting away from the previous SFO director's reluctance to provide formal written guidance, largely reiterates the best practices that have become articulated in previous SFO standards. In terms of privilege, the U.S. guidance has evolved to a clear position that eligibility for cooperation credit is not predicated upon the waiver of attorney-client privilege. The UK formalizes the position previously taken by the SFO that when necessary or appropriate, it will challenge assertions in legal privilege. And finally, information on the individual and third-party conduct. The DOJ's current guidance, as revised in 2018, requires companies to provide information about the individuals substantially involved or responsible for misconduct. The U.S. and the U.K. guidance both make clear that companies are expected to provide information about the conduct of third parties. So we link to in conclusion, taken together, the guidance and the recent practice in all three of these jurisdictions demonstrate how a coordinated strategy is essential for responding to parallel investigations. Companies should ensure that issues including deconfliction, privilege, and access to overseas records are discussed and reconciled with each investigation agency to avoid duplicative efforts, navigate compliance with local laws, and ensure maximum cooperation credit. So, Tom, you've got an article coming up next. What is the SFO's internal guidance? Why did they miss an opportunity?
Jay, this comes to us from Aziz Rahman. He is a senior partner in the international and corporate crime section of the UK-based law firm Rahman Ravelli. And it's posted in the FCPA blog. And he takes a look at some guidance, I guess you would call it guidance, from the SFO, which had a very soft release earlier this month. It is part of the SFO's operational handbook, and it is it's supposed to be internal guidance for the SFO prosecutors only. Matt Kelly, writing in Radical Compliance, said that it looked like an intern had photocopied a PDF and slapped it up on the website. It is 8 pages of documented title evaluating compliance programs, and it is some thoughts on what prosecutors at the Serious Fraud Office are to look at when they assess compliance programs. The guidance and what Aziz really bemoans is that the SFO could have really stepped up with some significant guidance here, and they did not do so. That the guidance is very, I don't want to say perfunctory, but it's 8 pages, whereas in the in the U.S. we had 19 pages in the evaluation, and commentary ran much longer. So an opportunity, I think, to provide some solid guidance was not taken by the Serious Fraud Office. The one thing that I thought was interesting was that it outlines the stages at which the SFO will examine a company's compliance program, and it's 3. 1 at the time of the alleged offending, when the decision is being made on whether to charge the company, and then in the future, when introducing evidence of and maintaining an effective compliance program. So what was the compliance program like when the incident occurred? What is the compliance program like when their SFO is making the decision to charge? And then at the time of prosecution, has it changed and into the future? So whenever you have guidance, it's good, Jay. We have, I think, a fair amount more in the United States, but at least we have some from the Serious Fraud Office.
So it is January 23rd, 2020. So that means you must be going into the home stretch of 31 days to a more effective compliance program series. What are some of the topics you looked at this week, Tom?
So, Jay, on January 13th, I looked at institutional justice. On January 14th, I considered risk assessments. On the 15th, I looked at how do you evaluate a risk assessment. On January 16th, I looked at third-party management process. And then on the 17th, I looked at managing a third party. Lots of good stuff out there, either through a force of insanity or great acclaim from my audience, Jay. It looks like the 31 days to a more effective compliance program is going to morph into 365 days of compliance in 2020. So look forward to lots more of compliance from the Compliance Podcast Network on this podcast, 31 Days to a More Effective Compliance Program, which now has its own iTunes channel.
Great. So any comments last week on the divisional championships and any pre-Super Bowl scuttle on your part?
So I was disappointed Green Bay decided not to show up. Would have liked to have seen a little bit of a game, but San Francisco was just completely dominant. I think it was, I can't remember if it's 7 or 12 passes Garoppolo threw. It was a ridiculous number.
There was a period between the second quarter and the third quarter where he went something like 12 minutes without throwing a pass. And, the ground game's working, grind it out.
Patrick Mahomes was just stunning. Tennessee played, I thought, as well as they could have. Yet Kansas City was able to answer everything Tennessee threw at them. I guess in terms of maybe we should hold off on any predictions till next week. But I was just disappointed that Green Bay didn't show up. Aaron Rodgers is 36 years old. How many more shots he's got? I don't know. It's much like Drew Brees. I think Drew's a year or two older. How many more shots does Drew Brees have? So we may really, and then of course the golden one, Tom Brady, 42. How many more shots is he going to have? And we really may be having a changing of the guard in terms of the top elite level quarterbacks in the NFL. Your thoughts?
Well, the job. Yeah, I think the job description for quarterback in the NFL has really changed over the past couple of years, and we've seen, the quarterback become real multifaceted. And not only do they need to run, and not only do they need to throw, but you've seen the different offenses out there that have been designed around different players. And what they do in San Francisco is certainly different than what they do in KC or what they do in Baltimore. But, I think the game is exciting from an offensive perspective. From the defense, they usually have the rules against them. So, it should hopefully make for a good Super Bowl. And we haven't had one of those in a while that was really truly competitive to the end. So I'm still looking forward to that. And, to your comments about the GOAT, I'm torn. Kraft would like him to retire a Patriot. I really can't see Belichick going out and getting the necessary pieces that Brady needs to move forward. And I think it's going to be just like seeing Johnny Unitas wearing an LA Chargers uniform. It just isn't right. And I can't see Brady playing anywhere else beside the Patriots. What say you about your Michigan brother?
No, I agree 110%. And I would just add on that he has increased the value of the Patriots franchise. I'm not sure exponentially, but certainly by some amount. And his performance as the GOAT in winning 5 Super Bowls, going to 7 Super Bowls, 6 Super Bowls, excuse me. I must be a trophy short. I think he should be compensated for that, and I think he should be paid for that. And if he's paid $30, $40 million, whatever he's paid, it is a pittance for what he has made for Robert Kraft in that franchise. And I hope that Robert Kraft will step up and pay him not only for the value he will bring over the next year, I hope however long he plays, I'll put it that way, plus what he's brought to the franchise and being the great Patriot leader he has. So I am like you. I do not want to see him in a San Diego Chargers uniform. I guess that can't happen anymore. But I don't want to see him in an LA Chargers uniform or anywhere else. And I'm afraid, as you are, that if he does go somewhere else, he will be wind up broken in half on the field somewhere. And that's kind of those pictures we saw of Y.A. Tittle when he was with the Giants, particularly last year, when he was so desperately trying to win his first NFL championship, will be the last pictures we have of Tom Brady. And I don't want his memory to be that.
All right, well, let's leave it at that for this week, and I'm sure we'll have some more specific comments next week as we move into the Super Bowl. On behalf of Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist and the voice of compliance, and myself, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, we'd like to thank you for joining us for This Week in FCPA, episode 189 for the week ending January 24th, 2020, the Off With Their Heads edition. Thanks for joining us, and have a great weekend.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. If you have any questions of Jay, you can email him at jrosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. You can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. I hope you will plan to join Jay and I again next week, where we take a look at some of the week's top compliance and ethics stories which caught our collective eye. Of course, we will continue to follow the Red Sox cheating scandal. It will be no longer the Astros cheating scandal. Also, we'll have our Super Bowl prediction, so I hope you will check in for that very special episode. This Week in FCPA is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks again for listening. I hope you'll join us again. If you haven't done so, please give us a rating on iTunes. It would greatly help our rankings for this show. We look forward to visiting with you again.